There are crimes that fade into the archives of history, and then there are those that will not let us go. The Watts family case belongs to the latter. It lingers, year after year, not because we need another true crime story, but because it forces us to confront a truth we do not want to believe, that sometimes, the danger is not in the shadows, but sleeping in the bed beside us. In 2018, Chris Watts confessed to murdering his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste. On paper, justice was swift. A guilty plea. A sentence of life without parole. A courtroom silenced by the horror of his words. But the echoes never stopped. Why does this story still haunt millions? Why do strangers pore over bodycam footage, interrogation videos, text messages, and diary entries as if they might find a clue missed by investigators? Why do whispers of motive, conspiracy, and psychology still fill digital forums years later? Perhaps it is because this case holds a mirror to our most fragile illusions. The illusion that love is forever. The illusion that family is safe. The illusion that what we see on our screens is real. The courtroom closed, the prison doors locked, but the story never ended. It survives in every unanswered question, every contradictory statement, every hidden message buried in Shanann's social media, and every sickening confession Chris has made from behind bars. This is not just another retelling of the murders. This is the story of the fractures beneath the smiles, the contradictions inside the confession, the digital legacy of a woman who refused to stop fighting for her family, and the hollow silence of the man who destroyed it. The Watts case endures not because of what happened on August 13, 2018, but because of everything we still don't understand. On social media, the Watts family seemed untouchable. A husband, quiet but dependable. A wife, radiant and tireless, smiling through the lens of her phone. 2 little girls with bows in their hair, giggling in kitchen videos and running across freshly cut lawns. And a baby on the way, a promise of a future more complete, more perfect. For Shanann Watts, the screen was not just a place to share life. It was where she built it. Facebook was her stage, her audience, her proof to the world that happiness was still possible despite illness, despite debt, despite doubts. She filmed everything: bedtime songs, dinner preparations, product promotions, even surprise announcements for Chris, who often stood stiffly at the edges of her lens. Every post was curated, intentional, designed to say, "We are thriving. We are in love. We are whole." But what the world saw was only half the truth. Behind the brightness of Shanann's online world, shadows deepened. Her marriage was strained. Her health left her exhausted. Bills piled high while Chris drifted further away, silent, unremarkable in public, but restless in private. There was an eerie duality in the images. Watch closely, and you see it. Shanann, expressive, talkative, driving the narrative of their life. Chris, often muted, his eyes wandering, his hands buried in his pockets, his smile stretched but never reaching his eyes. Millions watched their family videos, believing they were seeing love in motion. Few noticed the silence growing louder behind him. In the digital age, families live not only in homes but on screens. They become brands of themselves, proof that they are surviving, thriving, succeeding. Yet the more perfect the image, the more fragile it is. Shanann's posts were not lies, they were her defense. A shield against loneliness, a declaration of worth, a plea for permanence. But to Chris, that constant lens became suffocating. Investigators later uncovered private messages where Shanann voiced her unease. She felt him pulling away, retreating, growing cold. She asked for honesty. She asked for connection. Online, she continued to show joy, dancing with her daughters, cooking their meals, kissing Chris's cheek. Offline, she was fighting to keep him present. The contrast is heartbreaking. In one world, thousands of strangers liked and shared her posts, celebrating her energy and resilience. In the other, inside her own home, she was watching the man she loved become someone unrecognizable. This is why the case resonates so painfully in today's world. Because we recognize the split-screen existence. The curated reality versus the private storm. We scroll past families who appear perfect while silently wondering what secrets lie off camera. And in the Watts family, those secrets were not small. They were fatal. Every image of Shanann smiling now feels unbearable to watch, because we know what she could not, that behind her husband's reserved posture stood betrayal. That while she fought to keep her family intact, Chris was preparing to destroy it. The digital footprint of the Watts family was meant to inspire. Instead, it became evidence, a time capsule of illusions, half-truths, and warnings too subtle to stop what was coming. The family on display was not a family at all. It was a mask. And behind the mask, a collapse was already in motion. Every perfect image has a fracture line. For the Watts family, the cracks were there all along, hidden beneath Shanann's bright smile and Chris's quiet presence. To those who looked only through the window of Facebook, nothing seemed amiss. But to those who listened closely, who read between the words, the sound of strain was unmistakable. Money was the first weight pressing down on them. Their Colorado home, freshly built and beautifully staged, was also drowning in debt. Mortgage payments piled up, credit cards swelled, and bankruptcy loomed over their past like a ghost not yet buried. Behind the polished counters and filmed cooking demonstrations, bills gathered in drawers, reminders of a lifestyle that was as fragile as it was curated. Shanann carried more than the burden of debt. Her health, plagued by autoimmune disease, demanded constant management. Every day was a negotiation with her own body, exhaustion, pain, medications, diet regimens. Yet she still filmed videos, still smiled for her audience, still tried to build the image of control. For her, strength was not an option, it was a duty. For Chris, it became another reminder that their life was never truly easy, never entirely their own. But the deepest cracks lay not in finances or illness, but in family. The tension between Shanann and her mother-in-law, Cindy Watts, had festered for years. It was not a polite disagreement, it was open war. Cindy saw Shanann as controlling, too protective of the children, too insistent on boundaries she did not share. Shanann, in turn, saw Cindy as undermining her authority as a mother, dismissing her health struggles, and even endangering her daughters with decisions she could not forgive. The conflict boiled over in the infamous nut incident, when Shanann accused Cindy of disregarding her daughter's severe food allergy. What might have been resolved with apology became a fault line that split the families. Shanann's texts reveal a woman in anguish, begging Chris to stand with her, to defend their children, to protect their family. But Chris, instead of choosing a side, withdrew further, burying his emotions in silence. Her diaries tell the story most people never saw. Not the vibrant woman in bright lipstick and rehearsed smiles, but the vulnerable mother, afraid her husband was slipping away. She wrote of loneliness, of watching him retreat behind a wall she could not climb. She begged for intimacy, asked for honesty, feared abandonment. Each entry was a quiet plea, fight for us, fight for me, don't leave me alone in this. To the outside world, they remained the beautiful couple. To Shanann, it was already a battlefield, her against her illness, against debt, against in-laws, against the silence of the man she loved. She believed that if she just held tighter, just worked harder, just smiled longer, she could hold the pieces together. But Chris was already gone in spirit. While she wrestled with bills, defended her children, and poured her energy into keeping the family afloat, he disappeared into the refuge of detachment. He grew thinner, more distant, more polished on the outside, but colder within. When she asked him what was wrong, his answers were clipped, evasive, sometimes non-existent. The tragedy of these cracks is that they were not invisible. They were written in text messages, in diary entries, in moments captured by friends who later testified to Shanann's fears. She was not blind. She saw the collapse coming. She simply believed she could stop it. That belief is what breaks hearts most deeply. Because while Shanann fought to hold her family, Chris was already breaking free. And the cracks beneath the smile were not just fractures. They were the first tremors of an earthquake that would level everything in its path. The cracks beneath the smile were not the end. They were the beginning. Because while Shanann struggled to hold her marriage together, Chris was reinventing himself in silence. He did not shout, he did not fight, he did not even argue. He slipped away quietly, and in that silence, he built a second life. It began with the body. Chris, once unremarkable and unnoticed in the background of Shanann's videos, began to change. He shed weight, sculpted muscle, bought new clothes that clung tighter, projected a new self. Friends noticed his transformation and congratulated him, assuming it was discipline or health. Shanann noticed too, but she saw more than the scale or the mirror. She saw a man turning his body into someone else's, as if preparing for a life that did not include her. Then came the secrecy. Chris downloaded hidden apps, used encrypted communication, and tucked away his phone as if it contained a stranger's face. On the surface, he was still the father playing with his daughters, still the husband mowing the lawn, still the quiet man in Shanann's photos. But in the private corners of his digital life, he was someone else entirely. Psychologists who study double lives describe a chilling pattern, the construction of an alternate identity that runs parallel to the public self. The husband remains visible, but the lover lives in shadow. The father smiles on camera, while the betrayer texts in secret. Over time, the double life consumes the original, leaving only a mask behind. Chris Watts embodied that pattern. He told his mistress he was at the gym while Shanann was home with the children. He claimed to be on late work shifts while secretly meeting her. He spoke of separation, of longing for a fresh start, of a new love unburdened by the weight of responsibility. To her, he was a man in love. To his wife, he was simply absent, emotionally and physically. And here lies the most devastating truth, Shanann knew. In her diary, she wrote of her suspicions, her fear that Chris was slipping into someone else's arms. She confronted him gently at first, then with sharper desperation. She asked why he no longer touched her, why his eyes seemed to look through her. He denied, evaded, and withdrew. The double life is not only about lies told to others. It is about silence. And silence can be more lethal than words. The reinvention of Chris Watts was not sudden. It was a slow, deliberate peeling away of his old self. The man who once filmed pregnancy announcements, who once carried his daughters on his shoulders, was being replaced by someone leaner, more confident, more detached. Someone who saw his family not as his world, but as an obstacle. Criminologists call this stage the identity fracture, the moment when the person no longer sees themselves as bound by the roles they once filled. The husband becomes a stranger in his own home. The father begins to see his children not as pieces of himself, but as weights that anchor him to a life he wants to escape. It is a psychology as terrifying as it is cold. Shanann's friends would later recall her exhaustion, her tears, her pleas for reassurance. She still believed that if she worked harder, if she fought stronger, she could bring him back. What she could not see was that Chris was already gone. The double life had consumed him. And the cruelest irony is this: the more Shanann clung to her family, the more Chris clung to his secret world. He had become two men, the one smiling on Facebook, and the one whispering promises in the dark. But in the end, there was only room for one. And the man who emerged would leave nothing of the family that once defined him. Beneath every curated video and carefully written post, Shanann was fighting a war no one could see. It was a battle waged in silence, in the fragile hours of the night, when her body ached from illness and her mind raced with the weight of fear. She was pregnant again, a moment that should have been joy, but instead carried the heavy shadow of uncertainty. Her health had always been a quiet adversary. Diagnosed with lupus and plagued by autoimmune complications, she carried a daily burden invisible to those around her. To smile, to get out of bed, to care for two energetic children, and to manage a household in financial strain required a reservoir of strength most could not imagine. Yet Shanann never stopped. Her determination to keep her family alive and thriving was the very force that defined her, and, tragically, the very thing that exhausted her. Chris, meanwhile, was retreating. Friends would later describe Shanann's growing vulnerability, her increasing anxiety, her sense that her marriage was slipping away. She wrote about it with brutal honesty in her journals. She confessed her fears of abandonment, her sense of being unloved, her heartbreak at watching her husband grow distant just as she needed him most. There was another layer to her struggle, the emotional labor of holding together a crumbling home. Shanann managed the children's schedules, the finances, her health, her career, and still tried to spark intimacy with a man who no longer reached for her hand. She was not only a mother and a wife, she was the entire scaffolding of a fragile family. And when a woman becomes scaffolding, she rarely has the luxury of falling apart. The unspoken battles between them were not loud arguments or dramatic fights. They were quiet voids, nights where Shanann lay awake staring at the ceiling while Chris turned away, scrolling his phone in silence. They were dinners where she asked questions and he answered with a shrug. They were days when she posted cheerful photos online, only to send desperate texts to friends minutes later, confessing her fear that she was losing him. Control became a lifeline for her. She planned, she organized, she tried to fix what was breaking. In Chris's eyes, that control felt suffocating. But in Shanann's eyes, it was survival. When a woman senses abandonment, every detail becomes an anchor to hold the family together. Every meal, every schedule, every carefully chosen word is a stitch against unraveling. Friends later described Shanann as strong but vulnerable, a woman who carried the weight of illness, motherhood, and betrayal, yet still held herself with grace. They spoke of her loyalty, her drive, her fierce love for her children. But they also recalled her exhaustion, her tears, the moments when she admitted she didn't know how much longer she could fight alone. The tragedy of the unspoken battles is that they are rarely noticed until it is too late. Shanann fought hers quietly, believing her effort could keep her family from breaking. Chris fought his silently as well, but his battle was not for preservation. It was for escape. In every marriage there are moments of fracture, times when one partner feels unseen or unheard. But in the Watts household, those fractures widened into abysses. Shanann's battle was to hold her family together. Chris's was to carve himself free from it. And when those two forces collided, it was not compromise that emerged. It was annihilation. The saddest part is not that Shanann lost. It is that she never knew the battle she was fighting was already decided, not by her illness, not by her debts, not even by her own strength, but by the silence of a man who had already chosen to let go. The world knows the outline of the crime. But the story that lingers most powerfully is not in the shadows of that Colorado home, it is in the interrogation rooms, the body cam footage, the quiet moments where truth and deception collided. When police first arrived at the Watts house, their cameras captured more than just empty rooms. They captured Chris Watts in real time, pacing, shifting, his arms folded tightly across his chest. To the untrained eye, he was a worried husband. To the investigator's eye, his body betrayed him. The stiffness. The avoidance of gaze. The unnatural calm when panic should have been rising. The house was empty, but the footage already told a story. Hours later, in a stark interrogation room, Chris sat with detectives circling him like predators. They asked, they pressed, they cornered. At first he denied. Then he hesitated. Then he twisted the story into something almost unthinkable, blaming Shanann for the deaths of their daughters, painting himself as a man who reacted in horror. It was a lie. But it was a lie so cold, so deliberate, that it revealed more than silence ever could. The most haunting moment came when his father, Ronnie Watts, entered the room. A father speaking to a son, not as a detective, not as a judge, but as a man desperate to understand what could not be understood. Chris leaned toward him, whispered, confessed, not to murder, not in full detail, but enough to pull his father into the horror. That moment is seared into public memory. A man unraveling, but still clinging to control, still shaping the story for sympathy, still refusing to speak the whole truth. Confession, in cases like these, is rarely clean. It is a negotiation, a tug-of-war between guilt and self-preservation. Chris offered fragments, contradictions, rehearsed lines of regret. Detectives pulled at the threads, exposing the manipulation beneath. The truth was there, but it was buried beneath layers of performance. What makes this chapter of the case unbearable is not just the crime itself, but the performance of innocence that followed. To sit in a room with detectives and family, knowing the truth, and still cast blame on the woman already silenced, that is a cruelty that extends beyond murder. It is a second betrayal, one aimed at rewriting the very legacy of the victim. Beyond the crime scene, the case becomes not only a matter of forensic evidence, but of human psychology. How far can denial stretch? How deeply can someone cling to their own narrative, even when every fact contradicts them? Chris Watts gave us an answer, and it chills to the bone. The thin line between confession and manipulation is what keeps this story alive. Because in those rooms, on those tapes, we saw not just a killer admitting his crime. We saw a man bargaining with truth itself. When a crime rips through a family, the wounds do not stop with the victims. They spread outward, through parents, siblings, grandparents, turning love into suspicion, grief into war. In the Watts case, two families stood on opposite sides of a courtroom, bound together by blood yet divided by betrayal. On one side sat Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandy Rzusek. Faces etched with devastation, they carried not only the grief of a murdered daughter, but the unbearable weight of two grandchildren lost forever. Their silence in court was louder than any scream could be. Each glance toward Chris was a plea, and a curse. Why? On the other side, the Watts family sat in stunned disbelief. Chris was not just a killer to them. He was their son, their brother, the boy they had raised. To accept his guilt was to accept that their love had nurtured a murderer. And so, denial crept in. Excuses were made, blame redirected, letters written that attempted to soften his crimes. Cindy Watts, his mother, spoke of her love for him, her struggle to reconcile the gentle boy she knew with the monster the world now saw. The courtroom became more than a trial. It was a theater of grief and defense. The Rzuseks glared, their pain sharpened into steel. The Watts family wept, torn between the instinct to protect and the reality they could no longer deny. Between them lay an unbridgeable gulf, one family seeking justice, the other clinging to love twisted by horror. Even outside the courtroom, the division deepened. Letters unsent, words whispered behind closed doors, accusations traded in interviews and statements. One family demanded accountability. The other begged for understanding. Neither could find peace. This is the devastation of familial betrayal. It doesn't just take lives. It destroys the foundation of identity itself. For Shanann's parents, every memory of their daughter is shadowed by the knowledge that she trusted the man who ended her life. For Chris's parents, every memory of their son is poisoned by the reality that he chose destruction over love. And so the trial was not only about guilt or sentencing. It was about families split open, about love that could no longer coexist in the same room, about a courtroom that became a graveyard for every bond that once connected them. The cameras captured the glares, the tears, the moments when words failed. But what they could not capture was the silence that followed each session, the drive home for each family, the weight of absence waiting at the dinner table, the impossibility of rebuilding when the foundation itself had been burned to ash. The Watts family murders did not just end a wife and two children. They ended two families. And in that divide lies one of the cruelest legacies of this case, that love itself became another casualty. The Watts murders were not confined to a quiet Colorado neighborhood. They erupted into the bloodstream of the digital world, spreading across televisions, phones, and endless social media feeds. Within hours, the family's smiling videos were replayed not as celebrations of life, but as evidence of lies. And soon, millions of strangers became witnesses, jurors, and judges. The case became a spectacle of obsession. Armchair detectives dissected Shanann's Facebook posts, searching for hidden signals in her words, her smiles, even the way Chris stood beside her. Reddit threads swelled with theories, YouTube channels analyzed bodycam footage frame by frame, podcasts speculated on motive. Strangers felt entitled to declare who Shanann was, who Chris was, what went wrong. This wasn't just a trial in court. It was a trial by the internet. Shanann, already silenced by death, was dissected as if she were still on the witness stand. Some praised her strength, her devotion as a mother, her relentless will to keep her family whole. Others, cruelly, criticized her energy, her assertiveness, her control, as though her personality could somehow justify her husband's violence. In death, she became both saint and scapegoat, all through the distorted lens of strangers online. And Chris? He became the object of fascination, the face of evil hidden in plain sight. His interrogation videos went viral. Millions watched him fold his arms, pace the room, speak with chilling detachment. People replayed his interviews, hunting for micro-expressions, convinced they could read deceit in every twitch of his mouth. The internet wanted not only answers, but a sense of control, the belief that if they could see the signs, they could protect themselves from the next Chris Watts. But obsession has its shadows. Conspiracy theories emerged, accusing investigators of cover-ups, or suggesting Shanann staged her own disappearance. Some insisted Chris was framed, others accused the mistress of orchestrating the crime. In the frenzy, truth blurred. Grief became entertainment. The family's tragedy was consumed like episodes of a dark series, with viewers demanding the next revelation. This is what makes the case feel timeless. It is not only about murder, it is about how society itself devours tragedy. We live in an age where crimes are not only prosecuted by law, but by the court of public opinion. Where surveillance footage is streamed like cinema. Where victims are reimagined, suspects dissected, and grief replayed on loop for the world's consumption. For the Sussex, the world watching meant their daughter's life and death became a public narrative, endlessly picked apart by strangers who never knew her. For Chris's family, it meant the boy they raised was not only condemned by a judge, but by millions who had already written him into the annals of infamy. The world watched because the case felt close, too close. It was not a crime committed in some far-off city, by some faceless stranger. It was a family that looked ordinary, whose life was broadcast in the same way millions broadcast their own. And if the Watts family could shatter so violently, then what of the rest of us? Even after death, Shanann, Bella, and Celeste never truly vanished. They remained, not in the rooms of their home or the fields where their bodies were found, but in the endless archive of the digital world. Videos of Shanann speaking brightly to her camera, of Bella singing softly, of Celeste giggling in the kitchen, they live on, replayed millions of times by strangers across the globe. They are living ghosts, preserved by technology, haunting us in a way no case before them has. Shanann's Facebook profile became a memorial almost overnight. Friends scrolled through her posts, watching the rhythm of her life collapse in hindsight. Each photo became a clue, each caption a cry for help, each smile a question, did we miss it? Her videos were not only memories, they were evidence, dissected for tone, timing, and expression. What she shared to celebrate her family was transformed into a digital autopsy of her marriage. Bella and Celeste's laughter, once the soundtrack of innocence, became unbearable echoes. Clips of them running through the house or singing to their mother are now watched through the lens of tragedy. The innocence in their eyes is frozen forever, not aging, not changing, but locked in the digital amber of online archives. Their very voices remind the world not just of what was lost, but of what was stolen. The internet has always been a place where memory lingers. But in the Watts case, memory became obsession. Strangers who never met Shanann cried at her videos. Others, disturbingly, criticized her even after death, debating her personality, her marriage, her choices as though she were still alive to defend herself. In this way, Shanann was never allowed to rest. She was forced to live on as an online figure, a subject of debate, her identity shaped by those who knew her least. This is the eerie power of the digital footprint. Once uploaded, nothing truly disappears. The What's family story plays on loop, a ghostly cycle of smiling children, hopeful announcements, and the knowledge of the horror that followed. The videos cannot be unseen. They cannot be silenced. They are pieces of life that continue to speak long after the people in them were silenced. For Shanann's parents, this digital survival is both comfort and torment. They can still hear their daughter's voice, still see their grandchildren dance. But every replay is also a reopening of wounds. For Chris, locked in prison, these digital ghosts must be unbearable reminders of the family he destroyed, yet he has never truly confronted them with honesty. And for the world, these living ghosts are a reminder of how fragile the line is between public display and private collapse. They remind us that memory no longer fades into photo albums stored away. It lingers in servers, in videos, in feeds that never die. The What's family lives on in pixels and sound bites, in archives that keep the past alive. They are not gone. They are here, forever replaying, forever reminding, forever haunting. When the courtroom doors closed and the cameras dimmed, Chris Watts was delivered into silence. A life sentence without parole meant that his world would shrink to concrete walls, iron bars, and the sound of locks echoing in the night. For the outside world, justice had been served. But inside those prison walls, the story did not end. Chris became a study in contradictions. Stripped of freedom, stripped of family, stripped of the life he had once tried to reinvent, he still sought to shape his image. From prison, letters began to surface. Letters to strangers. Letters to admirers. Letters to those who claimed to see him not as a murderer, but as a man misunderstood. The words inside revealed not clarity, but a restless shifting of guilt and confession. In one letter, he spoke of God and redemption, as though faith could cleanse the horror of what he had done. In another, he admitted to new details of the murders, darker and more chilling than what he had said in court. The contradictions piled up, a man both repenting and rebranding, both confessing and concealing. His story was never one of complete truth. It was always fragments, always performance, always calculated for effect. Prison psychologists call it narrative control, the attempt by an inmate to rewrite themselves in the eyes of the world, even when the facts are unchangeable. Chris Watts was no exception. Behind those walls, he became a man clinging to letters, to Bible studies, to conversations that allowed him to appear human again. But every word he wrote was shadowed by the crime that defined him. No sermon could erase it. No confession could undo it. The haunting truth is that Chris's prison life became part of the obsession. Strangers reached out to him, fascinated by his crime, seduced by the idea of touching infamy. Some offered love, others forgiveness. For them, he was no longer just a prisoner, he was an icon of darkness, a man whose very existence behind bars fed their own twisted needs. And yet, in the silence of his cell, away from letters and cameras, what remains? A man stripped of identity. A man who murdered not out of passion, but out of a chilling detachment. A man who wakes each morning not to the voices of his daughters, but to the shuffle of guards, the clang of metal, the endless monotony of a life reduced to survival. The prison walls are both punishment and mirror. They hold Chris Watts in place, but they also reflect what he has become, a hollow shell of a man, a reminder that once you destroy the very people who gave your life meaning, nothing remains but the echo of your own betrayal. Behind those walls, Chris Watts is not simply serving time. He is serving eternity. Not in years marked on a calendar, but in the endless replay of his crime, in the eyes of a world that will never let him be forgotten. Even after confessions, courtrooms, and endless retellings, the Watts case remains unsettled. Not in verdict or sentencing, those are final, but in the unanswered questions that hover like smoke. Because in every word Chris Watts has spoken, there are contradictions, omissions, and silences that leave us asking, why? Did he plan the murders in cold calculation, Or did rage consume him in a moment that spiraled out of control? The evidence points both ways: the hidden affair, the careful lies, the secret apps, yet also the sudden brutality of the crime itself. Was it premeditated escape, or an eruption of long-suppressed resentment? What was Chris truly feeling in those final moments with his children? Did they sense betrayal in the arms that once carried them to bed? His shifting accounts make it impossible to know. Each version he tells distorts the truth further, leaving their last minutes cloaked in unbearable mystery. And deeper still lies the most haunting question of all: how does an ordinary man, with no history of violence, no record of cruelty, cross the line into annihilation? Was it narcissism, emotional emptiness, the psychology of someone unable to face imperfection? Or was it something darker? A capacity for evil that lived quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right fracture to break through? The tragedy of the Watts case is not only in what we know, but in what we will never know. Shanann's voice is silenced, her version of events lost forever. Bella and Celeste's innocence is frozen in images, their stories unfinished. And Chris's words remain unreliable, a shifting web of confession and denial. We are left in the shadows of unanswered questions, questions that keep the case alive in documentaries, in forums, in conversations whispered late at night. Questions that remind us the truth of what happened inside that house will never fully belong to us. What we still don't know is what makes this case impossible to let go. Because in that uncertainty, we are forced to face the terrifying thought that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in silence, in smiles, in the man we thought we knew. The Watts murders were not only the destruction of a family. They were the destruction of illusions, illusions we all cling to. That love is safe. That family is unbreakable. That what we see on our screens is the truth. This case lingers because it is not just about Chris and Shanann. It is about us. It is about the curated lives we display online, the secrets we hide in silence, the fractures we deny until they collapse. In the age of constant exposure, the Watts family lived like millions of others: smiles for the camera, cracks behind the door. And when the facade fell, the world was forced to look at itself. Shanann's story is one of resilience, of a woman who carried illness, debt, and betrayal, yet still fought for her family with everything she had. Her daughter's laughter reminds us of innocence too precious to be lost. And Chris's betrayal reminds us of the darkness that can grow, undetected, inside the most ordinary face. The haunting truth is that this case mirrors us all. It reflects the fragility of the bonds we take for granted. It asks us to question what lies beneath appearances. It forces us to admit that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are not strangers in the night, but those who share our homes, our tables, our lives. The Watts case refuses to die because it is not just history. It is warning. It is memory. And it is the shadow cast by a single family's collapse, a shadow that falls on all of us.